This is Join Us in France, episode 22. Hello, I'm Annie.
And I'm Elise.
And we welcome you to the Join Us in France travel podcast. Elise is a professional tour guide, art historian, and a really good storyteller.
I love to tell stories.
On today's shows, we take you to the beautiful Canal du Midi. The French word that describes it is bucolic.
Bucolic?
Bucolique. And I think it's bucolic in English.
It's bucolic.
Yes. So you've heard it. I didn't make that up.
Yeah, no, that's another word.
Good. Okay. And another word for it, like maybe pastoral,
I think pastoral is actually better.
Yeah, it's just a lovely, low-key kind of place, low energy. Well, not low energy. I don't know.
It's a... Well, I mean, it is... it's a canal.
Yeah,
it's a canal, but it is today. I mean, we'll talk about what it was and the history of it because it's a fascinating history. But of course, I think what you're referring to is that nowadays it's a canal that's used mostly for people to take what we could call slow travel trips.
Exactly.
It's 5 kilometers an hour.
Right.
You can't go very quickly on it.
And the only thing that's fast is the guys on the mountain bikes. They go zooming past. Really fast.
Right.
But we'll talk about
all
of that. Yeah, in a few minutes. So we are excited to be talking about this lovely area near to our home.
Near to our home, exactly.
And it'll give me a great opportunity to go with the camera and take lots of pictures. It'll be very fun. So we'll have a little music to get us in the mood, and then we'll get right back to it. Okay, we're back to talk about the Canal du Midi. But first, I have a short announcement to make. I'm feeling quite lonely on Google+.
Oh.
Yes. You see, I'm trying to reach out to new listeners, obviously. And so I decided I'm going to do some Google+ page, but it's very lonely. I only have one follower.
Oh, dear.
It's pathetic. So if you happen to be on Google+, listeners, you have to circle us. We're the Join Us in France Travel Podcast. And I don't post a whole lot. I post maybe a couple times a week. Something interesting I find in the news about French news or when there's a new episode or that sort of thing. And also, I think I'm going to try something new for YouTube. Because YouTube and Google Plus are linked very closely. They're owned by Google, both of them.
Both of them.
Yes. And so instead of doing a whole long episode with pictures, which I don't think a lot of people are going to want to sit through. I don't know. I couldn't imagine listening to a whole podcast sitting at the computer, like I explained last time, right? So what I'm going to do instead is take a short little bit of the podcast, something fun and quick and significant about that episode, and put a bunch of pictures to that and upload that to YouTube. So it'll be more a teaser than the full episode. You see? What do you think?
I think teasing people is fun.
So I'll try to tease. We'll see how we do.
I hope we do well.
Okay, I hope we do well. So now we're ready to talk about Canal du Midi.
Okay, so as you and I both know, because we live down where it begins, the Canal du Midi is a beautiful, beautiful thing to see. And it's also a major site in terms of the history of the southwest of France.
Yeah.
So maybe before I talk about the history, which is really, I know I say this all the time, but this one, it's really incredibly fascinating history. But I think before we do, let me just explain to people out there what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So it begins here where, in fact, we are, which is in the city of Toulouse. And for those out there who have no idea where that is, we are dead center halfway between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean in the south of France, approximately 100 kilometers from the Pyrenees as the crow flies, and basically landlocked.
Yeah.
We have a very huge river that runs through the city called the Garonne.
Yes.
Which starts up in the Pyrenees Mountains, but it flows not southeast towards the Mediterranean. It flows north and west, and empties actually into the Atlantic.
In Bordeaux.
In Bordeaux, in the
Right.
estuary called the Gironde, outside of Bordeaux.
Right.
So the story of the Canal du Midi, which means the canal of the south.
Right.
The Midi in French refers to the south of France.
Right. It also means noon.
Right.
But there's another meaning for it that just is completely different.
That's
Same
completely
word,
different.
but it means something
Right.
completely different. And
that
means
is the south,
And,
right?
and for people in Paris, you know, the Midi is huge.
The Midi is huge, right? I mean, we have our own distinctions between the different areas, you know. But
Yeah.
the Midi for people up there, you know, they're all up there anyway. You know, just those up there. It's the south. We're down here. So the canal is something that actually was started in terms of its construction in Toulouse, and it goes to the Mediterranean. It does not go to the Atlantic. And the reason for its construction is that there were many, many products through the history of France, really, really, really going back very far, that basically were stuck in the center of France and could not get out in terms of exporting and trade, except by going up the Garonne River and therefore going towards Bordeaux.
Right.
And
Shipping was
very, very precarious. It was done on the river. And these rivers are rivers that are very mighty and that flood a lot.
Right.
And
so it's unpredictable.
It's very unpredictable. And so what was thought of, and actually goes back to, believe it or not, it goes back to the Romans. The Romans who settled all of Gaul and who had major cities in the south and in the east of what is now France. They were very big on export-import, literally. I mean,
they wanted to do commerce.
They wanted to do commerce. I mean, even if it was the army that conquered, but their basic philosophy, if you will, was trade. And so what they wanted to do, of course, was bring goods in from other parts of the empire and get them out at the same time.
Right.
And at the time, and for a very long time, for centuries and centuries and centuries, literally, the only idea that anybody had was how to use the rivers, because that's what was there. And France is very fortunate because it is a country that has many, many, many rivers. It is a country with a very rich land, which is one of the reasons why it has always been, agriculturally speaking, the most wonderful part of Western Europe. And the rivers are abundant and they are everywhere. And the problem is that these rivers also tend to flood and they tend to dry out. And there are various times of the year when there are problems with river transportation.
Right. River, you have to use small crafts and...
You have to use flat bottom mostly, and you have to be worried about the time of the year. And the other thing was, and this is why it makes it really interesting when you think about it, goods from the south central part of France, in order to make their way out and go to the rest of the empire, we're talking about a long time ago when most of the land was huge, dense forest filled with animals. Filled with brigands, with people that were dangerous, just like in the fairy tales.
Highway robbers,
and even before that, just plain old robbers, you know. And this is what had to be done. So this goes back even as far as the Romans. Goods coming out of this area, if they made it to the Atlantic, going up the Garonne River, then had to get on bigger ships, go around Portugal, around the Rock of Gibraltar, around Spain, and back into the Mediterranean just to be delivered to places that were part of the Roman Empire on the eastern coast of Spain or along the coast of what is now, for instance, the Riviera and the Marseille, or even to go as far as Rome and Italy.
That was a long way to go.
It's a long way to go. And you have three things that are problematic. One is spoilage. Especially since one of the major products that came out of the center of France and for centuries was wheat. and wheat spoils, as we all know.
Of course.
The other was pirates. And there were lots of them. There were lots of them in the Bay of Gascony, which is the big bay off of Bordeaux, and of course around the Rock of Gibraltar and entering into the Mediterranean. It was known as one of the most dangerous zones for pirates ever. And the third thing was that Spain, which of course basically ruled the seas, not at the time of the Romans, but at the time of the Romans, it was mostly the spoilage and the pirates that were a problem. But later on, several centuries later, the Spanish made every ship pay to go through the Rock of Gibraltar, and it cost a fortune. So you either got your stuff stolen by the pirates, or you had to pay a fortune to have it shipped around.
Either way, you're not happy.
No. And in any event, it would take weeks and weeks and weeks, and the loss was always more than 50%.
Yeah, it's hard for us to realize how much of a hindrance this whole thing was, because I mean today we have roads, we have so many ways of transportation, but back then it was, if it was by horse or
by boat,
and
that was
much,
it, right? So this became a puzzle, and it was a puzzle that even the greatest engineers ever to live, Romans, could not figure out how to solve. And through the centuries, basically most people gave up on it. And so the south of what is now, the southwest of what is now France, basically stayed closed in. And whatever goods it produced were traded to nearby areas. And even after this part became part of the Kingdom of France, most of the goods that were going to be sent north, like to Paris, still had to go up the Garonne to the Atlantic and then shipped along the Atlantic going north. Or there were eventually a few routes that went from Paris down south, and those were used, of course, with carriages and horses. But for major shipping of goods, that didn't work at all. It did when it was the king traveling with an entourage and an army of 500 men around him. But it certainly didn't if you had to lug textiles, ceramics, or wheat up and down the mountains and through the forests. And as we would say, getting to worry about the wolf and Little Red Riding Hood, So this went on for centuries and centuries and centuries. And of course, this is a time when the idea of irrigation already was known, and obviously there were irrigation digs and canals in various parts of the Mediterranean
ditches,
world.
Yeah.
But nobody was thinking in terms of a canal that would really be big enough to have all of these barges, which are actually, and small barges, go up and down. And this went on for a very, very long time, long time, because we go basically from the Romans up until the 13 and 1400s, so we're talking a really long time. And there's a series of kings who think this would be really good. Now, of course, very well when we talk about the history of France, if there's a king in Paris who's interested in doing something down south, it's usually because it will get him money.
Of course.
That's basically it's not for the good of the people.
It's kind of still like that, I'm afraid.
Especially, with the centralized. We won't talk about that. But the kings kept sending engineers down to the south to see if there was a solution. And one after the other, they came back and they said, well, we can figure out where to place basically a waterway, a canal. But we don't know how to make sure that there's enough water in it to keep it going all year long without anything either drying up or without floods. Because the ideas that they came up with were not really to construct something separate. They were to try and connect one river to another. They were imagining doing all kinds of deviations of rivers and moving one river to another and creating ditches. And it was each time a new proposal came up. Basically, the king had enough more or less scientific men around him to say, no, we know that won't work. There's no point in investing a lot of money in it. It is just not going to work. And then finally, in the 1500s, that is in the 16th century, the fabulous century actually for everything in Western Europe. It's a fabulous century because it's the century of the Renaissance. And it's really, in spite of some major problems in terms of politics, it's a fabulous century for new ideas. And there's this king that I've mentioned before, and I will certainly be mentioning him again, Francois I, who was this big Renaissance man, and who is the first one to try and bring very, very important scientific people into this project. And he thinks he's come up with a project. And then when the engineers take a look at it and they go, no, this won't work. We still have not figured it out.
No can do.
No can do. By the end of the 1500s, there's a group of people down here in the Southwest, most of whom, interestingly enough, are amateurs. Like they're people who are minor noblemen, but they've become this kind of club, and their passion is, for whatever reason, it's very strange, trying to figure out a solution of how to basically open up this area. And of course, obviously,
bunch of geeks.
Bunch of geeks, except that they're geeks who are basically interested in making a lot of money. And so they employ the best technicians and the engineers at the time. And there is a certain amount of engineering technology available by the end of the 16th century. And one of these men is a man whose name is Riquet, Riquet. And he is a minor nobleman. He actually is from a town close to the Mediterranean, Béziers. Mm-hmm. And he is part of this group. And what happens is he comes up with a plan, and they send it to the king. And, you know, the king's always had a finance minister and a counselor who took care of all these things. And again, the king said, no, this will not work. No can do. And by this time, we're talking about Henry IV, who's an interesting king. And
so is that late 1500s?
This is the late 1500s.
Okay.
And so what happens is that this group of people, I don't know what happened to the others, but this man, Riquet, he dies, but he has transmitted this passion. It's like a contagious disease about finding a solution to this problem to his son. And his son's name is Pierre Paul Riquet.
Oh, okay. So
this is the son. Okay. And Pierre Paul Riquet was born in 1606 in Béziers. Mm-hmm. By this time,
nice place.
It's a very nice place. It's not very far from the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
And he inherits, as this is often the case at the time, the not only the title. His father was a minor baron or marquis. I'm not even sure, but he was not a big important nobleman. He was what they call a minor nobleman, but he also inherits his function, and his function, which is the way that he made money, was to be a tax collector. But I love this because, you know, in all through all this time up through the French Revolution, and then again we'll talk about taxes today. But tax collectors, it was a given that if your job was to be a tax collector, you raked off about 20% off the top of everything you collected.
Oh, goodness.
So that's how all these people wound up becoming very, very rich.
Yeah.
But what's wonderful to know, because this is something that has nothing to do with the canal, but it has to do with the money that this man had. He was the tax collector on salt. Mm. And the salt tax was called the gabelle.
Oh, that's right.
Isn't that a wonderful name?
So, gabelle.
The gabelle.
Gabelle.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And the reason why salt was taxed is because since there was no refrigeration and there was no electricity or anything like that, the salt was essential for preserving foods. Mm-hmm. And so the Mediterranean had enormous saline, which is the places where they would gather together the salt, and they would make it into big blocks, and it would be sold and distributed, and you had to pay a huge tax to buy your salt. Huh. And so this...
What a ripoff.
Well, today it is.
Today salt is the cheapest thing you can buy.
But it turns out that in other countries at that time, and for a long time, it was also something that was taxed because it was so important. So it's interesting.
Vital, yeah.
You know? Anyway, so there's this man, Pierre Paul Riquet, and he is a tax collector, but his passion, literally inherited from his father, is this idea of trying to find a solution for opening up the center of the southwest of France. And he's an amateur engineer. Mm-hmm.
And he wants to... Did he already know he wanted to dig a canal?
No. But he knew that...
He wanted a solution.
He wanted a solution.
Okay.
And it was really, as a boy, he would go with his father when his father with this group of men they traveled all through the Southwest of this area, basically, not as far as Bordeaux, but they traveled all through this area. And they would go up and down hills and into little valleys, and they tried to figure out what the solution was. Now, I don't know exactly how he did it, but in the process of the years that he walked around with his father, and then after his father died, when he did it himself, he started to think about where he could find a source of water that would be never ending, because this was the problem. And at this point, it became the idea not of trying to connect the different rivers, but of actually building something. Now, building something means a lot of money, a lot of manpower, and it means that it's a far more complicated and sophisticated project than just the idea of trying to find a way of connecting one river to another. By the time he's 50 years old, he thinks he has come up with a solution. Now, Mr. Riquet marries a young woman who has a fortune of her own, and they proceed to have a nice big family with 6 children. And 2 of his sons, as they grow up, they start working with him on this project. But he doesn't do this with other people. He consults engineers. He consults various other technical people in the 17th century. But this is his project. This is not a collective project. And what happens is, in the year 1652, he buys a piece of land that's actually visitable now, and it has an old fortified chateau on it. And the place is called Bon Repos, and it's only 15 kilometers outside of Toulouse, up on top of a hill. But the reason he buys it is because in looking at the piece of land, it's a piece of land that's something like 20 hectares, which is about 50 acres or something like that. He sees that the lay of the land is very similar to other parts of the land a little bit further east as you go towards an area that's not very far from here called the Black Mountains.
Yeah.
And he decides that what he's going to do, this is to show you the obsession he had, is that he's going to create a miniature version of what he thinks will work on his own land.
So he's going to test it.
He's going to test it. And so what
Brilliant.
he does is he builds 2 basins that he fills with water, and he buys for 6 years. This is fascinating because this is one of the things that I didn't know, because I knew a lot about him from having done a lot of this in terms of visits and interests over the years. He actually buys the water rights to a small river for a total of 6 years. And the water is the water that goes to a town that you and I both know, Revel, which is actually a very important market in the Middle Ages. So he actually closes off their source of water for 6 years.
How nice.
So he can funnel it into his land.
I bet they loved him.
They loved him, as you can possibly imagine. And what he does is he uses this water to create some basins, and he creates a system of canalization. The word in French is rigole, which is very strange, but it's basically large. No, it's not ditches. That's the whole point. It's not ditches. It's canalization. It's not open to the air. It's rounded, huge. It would be pipelines today. This is what we would consider to be like a huge pipeline system.
So what did he use to build the pipe?
He used stone, and he used a mortar, and he created these closed systems of I don't even know what the word is to use. I went and looked up on the internet and everything in there. There is no equivalent of that except that to imagine a very big pipeline kind of thing. And he tested it because one of the things he realized was, and this of course had been known before, but nobody was thinking in terms of building a structure. They were thinking still in terms of rivers.
Right.
Everybody knew, and probably even as far back as the Romans, that in the southwest of France, there is what we call in English a continental divide.
Yeah.
That is, there's a spot where the waters go on one side to the west and the other side to the east.
Sure.
Now, if you think about North America, it's in the Rockies. So everybody knows it's where there's a very, very big system of mountains.
Yeah.
But here, it's in a place where the height difference is only 172 meters.
Right. It's hilly, but it's not
It's
mountains.
just a little pimple, practically on the land. I mean, 172 meters is basically absolutely nothing. But in fact, if you stand on that spot, and you can go there and stand on it, what happens is when you see this water that now comes down from up further north, it feeds into these huge pipes. And then all of a sudden, it's like magic. On one side, it moves to the right, and on the other side, it moves to the left. And that is literally where the waters divide.
Yeah, it's a natural.
And so what he did was he did on a scale that is exact on his land. He did the same thing. He created a spot where the waters would have to separate going east and west. And he worked it all out. And he said, okay, the idea is we have to build a canal system. And I'm going to find the place where not only is the water separating left and right, east and west, but where we can figure out how to feed the water from up above, north.
So if you need to add more water in the summer.
So you don't have to worry about water ever drying up.
Right.
Now, what he didn't do, which is so interesting, is he didn't work out exactly on a map exactly where he thought every part of the canal should go. He just wanted to be able to prove that he had a system for feeding water into a canal. And then he wrote a letter. Mm-hmm. And he wrote the letter in the year 1662 to the king. And the king is Louis XIV.
Ah.
And good old Louis with Versailles, he's interested in only one thing, money. He's interested in getting as much money as he can. And he's actually, no, I'll take that back. He's interested in getting a lot of money, tax money, and money to feed into Versailles. But he's also interested in sticking it to his cousin, the King of Spain.
Oh.
Because the King of Spain, by this time, is making enormous amounts of money on the trade going around the Rock of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean, and the Spanish control the seas.
Sure.
And so what happens is that with the sponsorship of the Bishop of Toulouse, who is a friend of his, Mr. Riquet writes a letter that he addresses to a man named Colbert. Mm-hmm. Now, everybody here knows about Colbert because Colbert was not only the finance minister for Louis XIV, he was the everything minister. Basically,
yeah, we talked about him in a previous episode.
He's the yes man. I mean, you don't get anything done if you don't get the permission of Colbert. And of course, he does have to show the letter to Louis XIV. But basically, he's the one who controls the purse. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is in 1662, Riquet with plans and maps, and you can imagine what that express mailing would be like today. He sends documented evidence of how he is going to present this project, and he tells the king, this is a way of making sure that we have a way of getting goods not only from the center of the south of France out to the Mediterranean, but also, if we can build this waterway, we can connect the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, because if we join it up to the Garonne River, we can literally go from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic and forget the Spanish. We won't have to pay them any money anymore.
I can see how that would work.
That's
works, a good argument.
Right?
Yeah, that's a good
argument. Of course, at this point, what they're worried about is there's a lot of wheat that's grown in this area. Mm-hmm. There's also a lot of silk. And there's ceramics, and there's a lot of textile. And, of course, this is very valuable commodities.
Yeah, they would like to move that around.
They would like to move it around. And, of course, there's also wine that's grown down here. Mm-hmm. And besides the Bordeaux area...
We're happy drinking that ourselves.
We're happy drinking that ourselves. But they want it up north, too, because the Cahors and all of those wines, those were the wines that the kings wanted to drink.
Sure.
So what happens is the king looks at this project... Mm-hmm. And he's even included, and I'll talk about that at the end because it's incredible. Riquet gives a budget, and he explains how he expects to do all of this. Mm-hmm. And Louis XIV discusses this with Colbert, who's very skeptical. And Louis XIV says, this does have interesting prospects. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send the Royal Engineers down there, and I'm going to have them check this out. And I'm going to ask this man, Riquet, to give us a demo, not just on his own land, but actually do the beginning of the first part, which is to show us where he is going to feed the water from, and see if this really works, that the waters do go to this place where they separate to the east and to the west.
Proof of concept.
Proof of concept. And so this is, of course, we're talking 17th century. They send the engineers down. They visit his Chateau Bon Repos. They look at the project. They're very impressed by all the work he's done. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, takes about a year. He has actually set up a real demonstration by opening up. He has opened one of the small rivers that is directly north of where this separation of the waters is. And he's fed it into what is basically an artificial basin. And he does this one open canal, very narrow little baby canal, and he feeds it with the help of these people that work for him and his oldest son, who is his biggest ally. And they feed it into this spot, and they show these engineers that they can indeed have the water separate going east and west. And these engineers go back up to Paris, and they say, we think this can work. There may be some technical issues, and we have to figure out exactly where to place the canal along the way. But let's see if, in fact, we can do it. Now, this is what happens. This is why the story gets so fascinating as a human interest story.
Yeah.
The king, who has very little money left in the treasury, he's been sucking the country dry to feed into Versailles. Uh-huh. He says, okay, we'll give this man a chance to work this project out. But since I'm not sure if it's going to work, and since I want money, but I don't have a lot of money to give him, we're going to have to negotiate with him and work out some kind of a deal. Mm. And so this is what happens. So through Colbert, Riquet receives these documents, and basically they say that the king will give him a certain amount of money, a small percentage of what he thinks is the initial amount necessary. And the region, which is called l'État de Languedoc, which is very important, the parliamentary region called Languedoc, will have to also give him some money. And
Sounds
he will
familiar.
have to come up with the rest out of his own personal fortune.
Wow.
In exchange, because Riquet is no fool, he writes back to the king. Now, we can imagine, this is by horseback. How long does it take? It may take almost 5 days for something to go back in one direction between the south of France and Paris. Riquet sends back a message, and he says, in that case, since I'm proposing to make what will eventually be called the Royal Canal in honor of Sire the King, but if you're asking me to use my own money to help build it, I want the concession on the canal. You will receive your money as king, but in terms of the profits, the duties for people paying to use the canal to ship their goods, I want that to be in my family. And would you believe it or not, the king says, okay.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a good deal.
The king has nothing to lose.
Yeah,
except
what does he got? Yeah.
He has a little bit of money to lose, but basically he knows that he's not risking too much.
Right.
So this is what happens between 1666, when the canal is begun, and the year 1681. The canal is built, covering a total of 241 kilometers. That's a lot.
Yeah.
241 kilometers is about 160 miles.
Right. No, it's long, yeah.
It's long. The first stretch of the canal goes from Toulouse to a town called Trèbes, just on the other side of Carcassonne. The reason the first section of the canal stops at Trèbes is not because that's where the waters divide. It's because it's a small town, which in the Middle Ages was far more important than it is now. It's just on the other side of Carcassonne, which we have just talked about. But the reason it stops, this whole first section at Trèbes and not at Carcassonne, is because the people who ran the city of Carcassonne in the 17th century, in the 1600s, refused to invest the money to have part of the canal stop in Carcassonne.
Oh.
So they bypassed Carcassonne.
Oh, dear.
And they simply went past the old city of Carcassonne, And they went to Trèbes, which is the town that's about 8 or 9 kilometers further east of Carcassonne. And of course, they lived to be sorry, and then eventually had to create a little bit of a piece to add on to Carcassonne. But this is what happened. In the process of the building basically, the official opening was in November of 1682. So we consider that the canal took 16 years to build. In that 16 years, 12,000 people, men and women, worked on the canal. And Riquet, unfortunately for him, because he was apparently a fabulously passionate man when it came to dealing with all of this, and probably was very interesting to be around and talk to, he died in May of 1681. Literally 6 months before the inauguration of the canal.
That's a bummer.
And the story is, and of course we don't know if it's exactly true, but I think it's a wonderful story, whether it's true or not, is that he was already 71. He was not a young man. His son, his oldest son, who was his right-hand man, who was a person responsible for the finishing of all the work, was by his side when he died. He had exhausted himself, physically exhausted himself to try and finish the project. And they say that his last words were, "Is it finished yet?"
Yeah.
And so, unfortunately for him, his son was only able to say, "Papa, it is almost finished. It will be done in a few months." And so when it was finished, the entire canal, it consists of, and we'll talk a little bit about why it became such an incredible thing at the time. We're talking 241 kilometers. The change in altitude in terms of going up and down in various spots, because it goes down into valley, but it goes up across hills as well, is basically a total of 132 meters, which is not very high, except if you have to build a canal that goes up that far and then down the other side. You're talking about the flow of water, remember?
Yeah.
So what we have is there are a total of 65 locks on this canal. On the western side, between Toulouse and where the waters divide, there are only 17.
Okay.
On the eastern side, going from where the Seuil de Nauruze is, going out to the Mediterranean, there are in fact 48, because it's far more substantial on the eastern side.
Yeah.
There are 7 of a structure that was invented for this, and they are called canal bridges. And what they are literally bridges that have the canal with the water flow on top of them. They were never seen before, ever. They were invented for this Canal du Midi. There are 7 of them.
It's like a big aqueduct.
It's like an aqueduct with boats on it.
Yeah.
If you can imagine. That the water, they had to figure out, and there are 2 or 3 locks that are not locks in the sense of one lock on a canal, like we all know about the locks on the Erie Canal and blah, 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 blah. There are several where there are 8 or 9 in the same spot.
In a row,
because they have to control the waters. By the time the Canal du Midi was finished, and since it has been named the most important engineering accomplishment of the 17th century in Europe. And there was a very important military engineer named Vauban, who you mentioned the other day because you were thinking that he was responsible for something in Carcassonne. But of course, Carcassonne was earlier. But Vauban was a fabulously genius military engineer and architect who built all kinds of forts all over France. When the canal was finished, he was the one, right after the death of Riquet and when the canal was officially opened, he was sent by the king down to the canal to see if everything was properly built. And it turns out, strangely enough, and this happened within 4 or 5 years, that 2 or 3 of the things that Riquet did have built, which include the reservoirs, and one of them is a place that we both know very well, Saint-Ferréol, were not as sturdy as they should have been, and they had to be reinforced. So even within a few years, they had to have the Army
Maintenance.
Corps of Engineers come in and do some maintenance and strut certain structures. But what Riquet did was absolutely fabulous, because not only did he find a solution to a problem that had existed for basically 1,600 years, but he also was a man who, in terms of social reform, did something that nobody had ever done before. In fact, he got into trouble for it, because not only did he hire men and women to work on digging the canal, because they had to dig, they had to use shovels, they had to dig out the earth. He built places for the people to sleep. He built inns for people. He built restaurants for people. He paid twice the regular wage, and most of these were farmers and poor people who lived in the various spots. And what he did was, instead of forced labor, he got people to come to work for him because his wages were good. He gave them actually vacation pay. Can you imagine? This is in the 1600s. He gave them sick leave. He allowed them to be paid extra if they had to work on Sundays.
Wow.
And he encouraged people to work in the section of the canal where they came from, so they didn't have to travel very far. So
That's cool.
Along the whole stretch of the canal, he created, and he wanted to do something that he never accomplished, which was create new housing. This is a very modern idea. He wanted to create basically workers' housing, so that they would have decent, at the time, modern conditions to live in and would be able to stay in them. But what happened was that word got out to all the aristocratic landowners all the way around how much he was paying all of these serfs, because basically these were peasants that were working people's land.
Yeah.
And they complained to the king. And word got back to Riquet that he would have to stop paying twice as much as any of the wages anywhere else. So in the end, he paid more, but he didn't pay twice as much. But he did give him all of these benefits. And it turns out that approximately a third of the people who worked for him were women.
Wow.
And so he was considered to be a benefactor in every sense of the word for the Southwest.
Yeah.
And of course, what happened was, when the canal was finished, not only were people astonished to see the work that was done, because there are some basins that have triple rounded basins that are along the canal for boats to moor. There are these bridges that are also functioning as a canal. There were things done that had never existed before, but it, of course, opened it up to trade. Whereas in the past, it would have taken 2 or 3 months for goods to go from the center up the Garonne around into the Strait of Gibraltar and everything else. It took now 3 days to go from the center southwest to the Mediterranean. And immediately it was used for mail, for shipping goods, and, believe it or not, from day one, for tourism.
Oh, how nice.
But the tourism was very much minor factor. In other words, it wasn't really tourism as we know it. It was travel.
Yeah.
It was safe all of a sudden to travel instead of going through the woods and worrying about all of these bad animals and bandits.
Yeah, to
now,
go east to west.
People could just go as far as the Mediterranean without any problem at all.
Right.
So it was fabulous.
Right. So now the canal goes from the Mediterranean. They dug all the way to Trèbes.
They dug to Trèbes. And the second section, which started in 1673 and finished in 1682, went from Trèbes to the Mediterranean. And it opens up in the Étang de Thau, Thau, which is actually, and it was for this canal that they built Sète.
Oh,
there's a city,
big city. Yeah,
it's a nice big city that is a port city, and it was a small fishing village on the Mediterranean. But the actual port was built in conjunction with the Canal du Midi, so that the goods that were taken on the canal could be put onto bigger ships, which could go out into the Mediterranean, and then eventually up the Rhone or further east to Italy.
Right.
To Italy.
So where is it that you switch from the canal to the Garonne River?
You switch from the canal to the Garonne River in Toulouse.
Oh, I see.
In Toulouse. Now, this is what makes it so strange. was a genius. He thought of something that people had been trying to figure out for centuries and centuries and centuries. There were two things he didn't think of, and this is weird. And to this day, people wonder about it. He knew that he wanted to start in Toulouse because it was a major commercial center in the Middle Ages. The Garonne River, which of course cuts through in the middle of Toulouse and is the reason why the city is centered there, is a river that's capricious, that floods. It has zones that are impossible to go on with a boat. And of course, we're talking river boats, and river boats tend to be flat-bottomed boats. But the Garonne River in the city of Toulouse has a huge spot where the waters are very shallow. And it's a natural ford in the river that was reinforced later on by various different groups that came through and settled in the area. Now, for whatever reason, when he made his calculations, and of course this is also in conjunction with the engineers from the king, so who knows why none of them realized what they were doing, but they miscalculated. And so the canal actually stops not at the river, but about a mile away.
Oh.
You wonder, how did this happen?
Yeah.
I have no idea how this happened. So what happens is that you get this canal that is literally not on or opening onto the river, the Garonne River. It is literally exactly 1 mile away. And so all of a sudden, if you put goods on the Canal du Midi and take them out to the Mediterranean, that's fine. If you want goods to go from Toulouse to Bordeaux in the Atlantic, you put them on the river. How do you get goods that go from someplace east, moved up onto the Canal du Midi, then onto the Garonne, or vice versa?
Right.
Well, believe it or not, from 1680 until 1770, 90 years, the only way was to pull the goods off of the boats that were on the canal, drag them on land, get them back onto the river, or the other way around.
Bad plan.
Very bad plan. And so it wasn't until 90 years later that in Toulouse, a man who was very interesting and really deserves practically a podcast all to himself, and that is Loménie de Brienne.
I've heard of him.
You've heard of him, right? He said, we have got to figure out a way of stopping this nonsense. And since he was responsible for doing almost all of the work that helped turn Toulouse into a city that moved out of the ancient Middle Ages into the period called the Enlightenment, this is the 1770s, he paid and got the city to pay for a little canal that is exactly 1 mile long, that is now called the Canal de Brienne, which connects the Canal du Midi to the Garonne. Now, the Canal du Midi, the rest of the story of the Canal du Midi. The Canal du Midi was called, at the beginning, the Royal Canal of Languedoc.
I see.
Named after the king.
I have never heard it called that in my life.
You ain't that old, sweetheart. Neither am I. Neither am I. Really.
Well, I'm reassured now.
You're reassured now, right? In the time of the French Revolution, the canal, as you can guess, was called the Canal of the People of the Republic of France.
Of course.
It's very cumbersome as a title.
Yes.
Right? And soon after the revolution, in the 1800s, Napoleon called it the Napoleon Canal. He did that to everything. It's unbelievable. And then finally, starting in the I think it was 1848, but I'm not sure exactly of my date, it went back to being called the Canal of the South, which means the Canal du Midi.
Canal du Midi.
And that is what it is now. It is what it is named now. Now, just a little bit of statistics, just because this is totally amazing. Remember, the king said he had to use his own fortune as part of the money to pay.
Yeah.
The original estimate of budget for the canal was 6 million what they would call pounds at the time, which was basically 6 million gold coins or whatever you want to call them. The final cost was 18 million. Riquet,
budget overruns.
We can call that. Oh, yeah, exactly. It's 6 to 18. Okay, 3 times as much. Riquet hawked everything he owned. He borrowed on his fortune. He borrowed on his wife's fortune. It was not until the time of his grandchildren, 50 years later, that they actually started to make significant money and stop paying back the debt that the family had to the bankers for having been the ones to create the canal. So what we're talking about 50 years later is in the middle of the 1700s, 1680s, 1730s. In the 1730s, the family became incredibly rich. The son, the grandson, they ran it for him. From the 1730s, this was fine until 1789 and the French Revolution. French Revolution, it's the Royal Canal.
Let me guess.
Confiscated.
Yes.
Confiscated, turned into the canal public, blah, 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 blah. Taken out of the hands of the family Riquet, which has become a family of very rich, noble people in the southwest and become magistrates and all of this kind of thing. In 1858, after the revolution, after it's gone through all of these upheavals and everything, Napoleon III, who is the nephew of the original Napoleon, who has come into power for a short period of time.
Yeah.
We're in the middle of the 19th century. The canal has been used since it was opened for trade and mostly for mail by the time that we get into the early 1800s, but still for shipping wine, wheat, very important commodities that need to be shipped rather quickly. What happens is that the trains start to appear in the middle of the 19th century, and Napoleon III decides to take the concession for the canal and turn it over to the train company, the Chemin de Fer. Well, guess what? The Chemin de Fer decides that they don't need the canal anymore for shipping goods because they're starting to send trains everywhere because they're setting up trains everywhere in France. Yeah. And so, of course, what happens is that goes on to do a great decline. And by the very beginning of the 1900s, there's only wine trade and a little teeny little bit of other kinds of trade, but very, very little trade. And basically, it ends by the First World War. There's a teeny little bit left, but basically it kills off the trade. Now,
so it's not profitable anymore.
It's not profitable anymore. For 250 years, the canal helped people in the southwest of France live economically. However, what's interesting to know is, and this is for people who you'll see the photos, but the canal is very small. The canal is only 2 meters deep and at the widest, absolute widest, 20 meters wide.
Yeah, it's not very big.
Which means that it was never able to be the huge economic boom that it should have been, because when they built the canal, they didn't build it wide enough for large barges.
Right.
And after the Canal du Midi in the 1680s, they were inspired to build other canals all over France. So there's a huge system of canals all over France, and they are all much, much wider than the Canal du Midi. And so there are some that are still to this day used for carrying goods up and down. And the reason why the Canal du Midi was not able to is simply because it was just much too small. It never dried out. However,
that's right.
There are problems with the accumulation of silt. So every single year, it is closed down for 2 months in the winter so that it can be dredged. And that, of course, is absolutely necessary, because otherwise there would be no waterway at all. And now, and that specifically since basically the middle or the second half of the 20th century, it is used for boats for pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah, they have barges on there.
There are barges on there that you can rent. Now, there are two ways you can do that. You can actually go on a trip. There are little 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour excursions that you can do. You can go with somebody who has one of these boats, because there are various stops along the canal where you can do this. And they just take you on a little tour on the canal. Or, and this is what's become very fashionable, so that now there are approximately, in a summer season, 10,000 people who do this. And it started largely with people from Northern Europe and from England. But you can rent a boat, and most of the boats sleep 5 or 6 people. Some of them are a little bit bigger. And you get a lesson that takes about 2 or 3 hours on how to drive or conduct one of these boats, because they literally do go only 5 kilometers an hour. But the only problem is you have to really know how to maneuver them, because some of the underpasses are so narrow that you literally have only a few inches on each side to get the boats through. But what it is you can do a week at a time. You can do a few days at a time. Most people take bicycles, and they moor in various different basins, and then they go off on their bicycle and visit villages and things like that.
Yes.
And it's a kind of nice, slow and easy summer vacation
and
to
all,
take.
And all along the way you have, because you did mention this, but in the olden day, in the beginning of the canal, it was horses that were pulling these barges.
Yes. And you're absolutely right. I didn't mention that. In fact, what happened was, this is what's so interesting, is that, of course, there are wonderful pathways all along the canal, which you can now use. You can literally get on a bike and go from Toulouse to the Mediterranean along the Canal du Midi.
Right.
The Riquet planted trees along the canal for 2 reasons. One, to create shade so that the water would not be evaporated, but also because it was horses that were pulling these barges. And when a person did not have the money to buy a horse, they actually put the harnesses on their backs, and people pulled the boats along the canal.
Wow.
So there were at any given time several thousand of these horses that were working the canal. And it's quite amazing. When the canal was built, there were 45,000 trees planted. By the time of the French Revolution, there were 100,000 trees along the canal.
Right.
And as you and I both know, even if you drive along one of the roads that follows, there's sections of it you can following along a road. It's beautiful because it's lined with trees. Now, what's interesting, which I didn't know, was that at the time that the trees were first planted, it was different kind of trees, because they wanted trees that grew very quickly and adapted to having their roots in the water. So they planted poplars and willows, which of course are very fast growing trees and have roots that go into a water system.
Yeah.
By the end of the 1700s, they had planted a lot of mulberry trees because this region had the silk industry. And so they were planting the mulberry trees so that they could have leaves to feed the nice little silkworms.
And they grow like wild.
And they grow wild around here. Yeah. And when the silk industry in this area died out, which is very interesting because it basically died out at the time of the French Revolution, they planted a different kind of poplar, a poplar that's called an Italian poplar. I quite honestly have no idea what it looks like in comparison to a regular poplar. And then in the middle of the 1800s, they planted the plane trees that we have there now. And for those of you out there who have an idea, it's a tree that's like a sycamore. It's in the family of the sycamore trees. It's got this very beautiful mottled bark on the trunk.
Yeah.
And it's very, very beautiful shade tree. And it has to be cut back and trimmed every year.
It's the platane.
It's the platane, which is in English the plane tree.
Plane tree, yeah.
Now, just a couple of other very quick little anecdotes, because I think it's really incredible. The horses and the fact that they were being pulled, the boats were being pulled along. They introduced motorized barges in the 1930s, but they were still using horses up through the 1970s.
Oh, wow.
And the last horse and the last commercial use of the canal was actually in 1980.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that amazing?
Well, I thought it was used today, sections was used today to float the big sections of A380.
I'm not sure about that. I don't know if they do that because, first of all, it's not very wide, the canal.
No, but I think it's in Bordeaux. I think when they come
That would be the canal, the Parallèle de la Mer. That's a different canal.
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
not the same
Okay.
one. That canal was built in the 19th century, and it's very wide and it's flat. So it's not.
That one's
it's
different.
not. It's
Okay.
not the killer. And just one last thing, which I thought was really amazing. Thomas Jefferson came here in 1789 to study the functioning and the construction of the Canal du Midi, because at the time, he was ambassador of the United States to France.
Yeah.
And he wrote a letter back to George Washington, and he said that he thought it would be fabulous if they could use the same system to build a series of canals. And he wanted to create a canal. And I went online and looked at the distance, and I thought, this is really talk about hallucinating, because I can't imagine. He wanted to build a canal that would connect the Potomac, which is, of course, Washington, D.C., and to the to Lake Erie.
Oh, yeah, great idea.
It's a little far, It's not quite the same distance. I mean, even here,
It's American size.
It's American size. I mean,
Yeah.
here we think of the distances, 240 kilometers. That's pretty big. I thought, no. Potomac to Lake Erie. Well, okay. He never did. They did do a canal on the Erie, but it was not quite the same length. But the Canal du Midi is in 1996. It became a World Heritage Site for UNESCO.
Yes.
It is labeled as one of the major building projects of the 17th century for all of Europe. Riquet is considered to be a hero.
Yes.
And there are two things that you can do if you come in this area. One, of course, is to take a little bit of a ride along the canal. You can bike along the canal. Of course, you can rent a boat. You can run along the canal. But the other thing, and this has only been possible in the last few years, and I did this last year with a group, is you can go and visit the Chateau Bon Repos, which was just recently bought up by the village that it was in. And it is being fixed up again. And you can visit and you can see, even though it's a bit overgrown with grass and stuff like that, you can see where he did his experiments.
Oh, that's cool.
To test this idea. And it's really fabulous. So that's basically the story of the Canal du Midi.
Yeah. Oh, it's a great place. And I see a lot of lovely boats. Some of them, I mean, there's the classic big barges every now and then, but you see much smaller crafts nowadays that are prettier and newer, and people seem to have a good time.
I guess you wouldn't even call them barges anymore, because the barge, of course, is, we all know what basically a barge looks like. The little boats that are used mostly as rental boats have flat bottoms. Obviously, they can't have a keel that's very, very big.
Deep, yeah.
But they are designed with cabins inside, and they're kind of cute, and they don't make a lot of noise. And one of the things that's fun to do is, even when you don't have a boat, even if you don't rent a boat, you can go to one of the stops just outside even of Toulouse, where they still have the locks. Oh, and that's one thing I didn't mention. 1/3 of the locks are still the original locks from the 1680s, and they're still opened and closed mechanically. And there are people who live in the houses there that turn them and open and close.
Yeah.
Or people have to jump off of the boat, go up the ladder, and do it themselves. When the canal was finished, there were chapels, there were auberges, restaurants, there were hotels. There were even places with ladies of ill repute for the workers. They had a whole series of things built at the stops along the canal. It's just kind of cool place.
Yeah. Nowadays, when I go, I take the dogs. It's a very nice place to walk the dogs, because it's mostly flat, until you get to a bridge, and then you have to go up a little bit.
Then you have to
back
go up
down.
a little bit.
Yeah, but it's very good. The only problem with it is the mountain bike people are just crazy.
Yeah.
They come up behind you, and they're going so fast, and I'm always worried that one of them is gonna, kill one of the dogs. Well, nobody's ever hurt the dogs, but I worry about that.
She loves her dogs.
Yeah. And the joggers are much easier to deal with.
Joggers are much easier.
Because, they can...
Yeah. But it's true, because there are lots of people who use the paths, the trails for doing sports.
Sports, yeah.
But it's really... I know a couple who decided to do... they're not mountain bikers, but they just took camping equipment and they went for a week.
Mm-hmm.
And they stopped in different places and on their bikes, and they got off and they went and found ahead of time places where they knew they'd be able to camp. Because in France, of course, you have what they call camping à la ferme, which means you can go and put your tent up on somebody's farmland for the night. And they said it was really a nice thing to do.
Yeah, and there are a few places along the canal where I go with the dogs where people can go and bring a canoe and, canoe along between two locks.
There are some nice places with some basins, and to my surprise, I was just reading because I was looking up the information about how they have to clean it up, of course, now every single year, and that I knew. I've seen some of the dredging, but to my surprise, there is actually there are 3 kinds of freshwater fish in the canal. You don't usually see people fishing because, to me, the waters are not very clean.
Doesn't look that way.
Doesn't look very clean to me. Yeah. But they say that's a good sign. It's getting cleaner. Because fish wouldn't be there if it wasn't.
Yeah, and they have some kind of mammal that lives along there.
Oh, the
marmot or whatever.
No, it's muskrat.
Muskrat. Yeah, and they're doing some damage to the roots of the trees.
They're like beavers. They like those kinds of places, so they have to see if they can find them alternative housing.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Elise. That was very interesting. I really encourage people to. Even if you don't want to do a whole cruise on the Canal du Midi, and I'm told some of these are pretty fancy, where, you can rent a boat with a crew. So you're going to have a crew of 2 people, and they're going to be doing all your meals and all your, and I mean, it's expensive, but
yeah, there are some like that. The truth is that there are more trips like that on the other canals in France. Mm-hmm. Because there really isn't space for bigger boats on the Canal du Midi. Right. So yes, you can hire a boat which has its own captain, who I think is often the person who also does the cooking and everything like that. Although there are sometimes 2, and some people do that, But more often on this particular canal, on the Canal du Midi, you will find groups of 4, 6 people or whole families who rent the boat. And
it's usually families or friends, and they just rent together.
It has a kitchen, and it has an area that's like a little bit of a living area, and
it's like camping, but on the water.
It's camping on the water.
Very good. Okay, well, don't forget, everybody, if you go to Google+, don't let me be so lonely out there.
She's going to cry.
Yes.
Contact Annie, please.
Yes. I mean, we love having the Facebook page. We have many more people there.
Many people.
But on Google+, is there anybody out there? Okay, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you soon.
Au revoir.
Bye.